Dark Souls 3 is a game with a lot to live up to. Not only does it have to follow the exceptional Bloodborne, but it is also presumably the final installment in one of the most revered gaming series of at least the past decade. It's a game that arrives with a pre-established fanbase, chomping at the bit to see and experience everything that the game has to offer, while screaming spoilers at the mere mention of a boss name. To say Souls fans are devoted would be to put it very lightly. However, with each subsequent entry, it becomes more and more apparent that this series, more often than not, deserves all of the love that it gets. FromSoft has spent the best part of a decade now developing their thing. That blend of harsh, action RPG style gameplay, lack of hand-holding and masterfully crafted environments, as well as that loop of death and self-improvement, has spawned many pretenders. Some good, some not so good. If Dark Souls 3 proves anything, it's that FromSoft are still the original and best proponents of that winning formula. If you've played any of the previous games, then you'll feel right at home here. Not much in terms of core design needed to change, and as a result of this, Dark Souls 3 strongly resembles its predecessors. From Demon Souls to Bloodborne, From Software have created and let us loose on just about every dark fantasy environment possible. Sadly, this results in many of Dark Souls 3's assortment of areas feeling like a neat little collection of everyone's favourites from the previous games. I feel the game suffers from a lack of individual identity, instead opting all too often to reference back to previous entries without carving out its own. But that's not to say that the lands of Lothric aren't enjoyable to explore. In many cases they feel like the best possible versions of past environments, with what feel like reimagined variants of locations such as the Catacombs and everyone's favourite, Blighttown. However, a few more areas unique to this setting would not have gone amiss. Dark Souls 3 may well offer the most linear world progression in the series yet, and some will certainly find this to be disappointing. Gone are the days of players heading out through branching paths that lead off to a variety of undiscovered areas in search of better loot, where you always run the risk of sprinting straight into enemies far beyond your current level. That freedom to explore the world at will, as well as a sense of adventure and rebellious achievement in beating the areas out of order, is sorely missed here. That being said, Dark Souls 3's environments are multi-layered and packed with reasons to venture that bit further away from the safety granted by a bonfire. Bonfires still feel like checkpoints, meaning that once you reach the next one, the previous ones feel largely pointless due to the linearity. I also felt that there was a lack of consistency with the placement of these bonfires. You often stumble upon one after another, meaning that in some instances there is little tension, as you know the next checkpoint is a stone's throw away. And then in other areas, bonfires that are annoyingly sparse, meaning that dash towards the boss fight feels extremely repetitive and unjustifiably long. Regardless, in terms of world design and acute detail, most other games at their best are still no match for Dark Souls at its most derivative and linear. The core combat remains largely unchanged. It's still the same challenging game of waiting patiently for enemies to reveal their patterns, learning them and then using that newfound knowledge to dispatch them with increasing ease. Button mashing is rarely if ever a viable tactic, forcing you to choose your moments for attack wisely. Some long withstanding issues remain unaltered, such as the often messy lock-on and occasionally unhelpful camera, which is especially a problem when facing faster moving or larger enemies. I feel like the whole harsh but fair design philosophy was truer here than in previous entries, as I seldom felt like the onus for death wasn't on me. There was always something you could have done better, some trap you should have avoided or some enemy you should not have aggroed. Get cocky and take one too many swings at a boss, then get caught out because you've used up all your stamina? Well, tough luck. Better make sure you learn from that mistake. FromSoft is still a master of teaching players the fundamental aspects of their games through the moment-to-moment gameplay, rather than some heavy-handed tutorials. Those who complain about Bloodborne's relative lack of weapons will be pleased to hear that weapon variety in Dark Souls 3 is one of its greatest strengths, and they're not just great in quantity either. Movesets for most weapons feel more refined than ever, almost always offering players a useful and diverse range of attacks. The mana bar has now been given purpose for non-magic users in the form of weapon arts. Not every weapon benefits from this addition, but those that do are given either useful and deadly new attacks, or in the case of my weapon for most of the early game, the Deep Axe, a buff called Warcry, which enhances damage and gives the player a chance to stun nearby enemies. And whilst they may not exactly be game changing, the inclusion of these weapon arts adds another layer of depth to the game's already excellent core combat. Everything you could want in terms of satisfying challenge is here, but it all feels more accessible. Dark Souls 3 eases you into the experience with 3 early bosses that offer just enough challenge so as not to put off newcomers. There is no Father Gascoigne-sized mountain in the way of early game progression here. That's not to say that the entire game is like this. Dark Souls 3 contains some of the greatest, most challenging boss fights in the series' history. Bosses come in all shapes and sizes, all ready to lure you into a false sense of security, making you think that you know their patterns before offering up one last surprise before you get a chance to strike the killing blow. From gargantuan beasts such as the cursed-rotted Drakewood and lumbering crowds of mages that are the Deacons of the Deep, to smaller humanoid enemies called the Abyss Watchers who fight amongst one another, they all feel dangerous, surprising, and varied. Enemy AI is more aggressive than in previous Souls games. Think Bloodborne's enemies slowed down a tad and you're on the right track. Sadly, this leaves magic users at a disadvantage, as most enemies can cover so much ground in such little time that ranged combat feels largely useless in PvE. Like the bosses, all enemies feel varied in terms of their movesets and abilities. Some rapidly morph into a sort of Ouroboros type monstrosity, whilst others sprout wings, going from static husks to genuinely dangerous combatants at a moment's notice. It's not quite as impressive as some of the design work seen in Bloodborne, but it's a vast improvement over the variety seen in Dark Souls 2, whose enemy roster seemed to consist largely of varying takes on men in armour. During my first playthrough, I encountered numerous frame rate drops on the PlayStation 4, as well as a handful of small bugs, the two most notable being one that caused an enemy to sprint through a hill, and another which resulted in me being stuck in a wall. Visually the game ranges from impressive to downright ugly in some places, but I still came away believing in the world that FromSoftware had created. Whilst by no means cutting edge, the game still manages to create moments of awe with multiple stunning vistas. The world here feels grander in scope than ever before, as it's almost always possible to get a good viewpoint of where you've been and where you're going. It's also densely packed with detail and subtle environmental storytelling that I just want to see what they could do with a more up-to-date engine. Enemies now give out a reduced amount of souls. However, this doesn't necessarily equate to more grinding, as there are always other means of leveling up and increasing your character's usefulness in battle. It is now easier than ever to infuse weapons with elemental or magical buffs, as there is a steady flow of upgrade items, as well as the specific stones which allow you to remove buffs, giving the player more flexibility in terms of how they want their weapon to perform. I found that the game does a good job of explaining core upgrade mechanics and the functions that some NPCs serve, without ever feeling like it's holding your hand at any point. Ultimately, Dark Souls 3 is still very much worth your time, especially if you're a fan of the series. Whilst it may not be the breath of fresh air that Bloodborne was, and Lothric can't quite rival Lordran in terms of world design, I'd still say it adds enough subtle improvements in terms of the refinement of core combat and the inclusion of weapon arts that I can't imagine anyone coming away from this feeling like it was a bitter disappointment. Just the fact that it offers another haunting trek through such a meticulously detailed world is just dripping with atmosphere and personality, to the point where you love being a part of it despite the overwhelming misery and show, makes the whole thing worthwhile. In a way, a celebration of past successes feels like the most fitting end for the series, and that is certainly what Dark Souls 3 sets out to be. It reminds us of the stunning accomplishments of its developers FromSoftware, a studio which time and time again delivers us the type of experiences that only they know how to, and it is genuinely hard to find fault in that.